Şüpheciliğe yanıt vermenin en iyi yolu nedir?
I think skepticism is not always a bad thing. Philosophers can sometimes set out to solve the problem of skepticism, thinking that skepticism is the enemy. Sometimes skepticism is entirely appropriate. If you think of skepticism as a kind of questioning or inquiring attitude, an attitude that challenges someone's claim to knowledge, sometimes that's exactly what you want. I mean, if somebody's promising you very lucrative investment opportunity, you get an email from a stranger. The skeptical attitude is entirely appropriate there. It's good to challenge and question sometimes. Skepticism, I think, crosses over into being problematic when that questioning, inquiring attitude becomes a sort of fixed posture, and you can't do anything but question and inquire, and you can't actually accept any positive claim. I think there's a couple kinds of skepticism. There's, in classical terms, there's a sort of academic skepticism where the skeptic comes out and says, knowledge is impossible for human beings. We cannot know anything. I think actually that kind of skepticism is relatively easy to deal with, because the skeptic who gets up and says that can be challenged, on the grounds that, how could they possibly know that? How could they know that very strong claim? It seems like there's something a little bizarre in making a very strong claim of that sort, if you're simultaneously claiming that human beings can't know anything. So I think that kind of skepticism isn't the most difficult kind of skepticism to fight. The most difficult kind of skepticism is the Pyrrhonian skepticism, which just questions. So the Pyrrhonian skeptic is the person who just says, "Are you sure?" After anything that you say, or just keeps investigating, keeps inquiring. Anything you might put forward, they'll put forward something on the other side. That guy is really hard to handle, partly because in order to argue with somebody, you need to have some kind of common ground. And the Pyrrhonian skeptic isn't giving you any. He's sort of demanding an argument, but not giving you anything to work with. You don't have any premises that you can use against the Pyrrhonian skeptic, because he'll, raise an eyebrow at any premise that you try to put forward. And for that reason, I think when you encounter a Pyrrhonian skeptic, you realize something's gone wrong. There's some kind of problem here with the ordinary structures that we use to interact with each other. And Pyrrhonian skepticism is really interesting because it's something that emerges in a wide range of very different philosophical traditions. It seems to be tapping into some kind of human universal. So you'll see skepticism emerge in classical Chinese philosophy, classical South Asian philosophy, of course, Greek philosophy, contemporary Anglo-American philosophy. It's something that just keeps coming back. So it seems to be resonating with something in us as human beings, that it's possible to take this very, very dialectically powerful questioning position and make people feel uncomfortable with any positive claim they might put forward. Some people, I think Duncan Pritchard notably, suggest that radical skepticism is the product of a bad kind of philosophical thinking. And I think that's actually not quite right, because I think the same inclinations that take people in the direction of skepticism emerge even in people who are not professional philosophers. You can get very ordinary people and ask them a sequence of questions, and they will end up in a place where they're going to deny that someone has knowledge in situations where they normally would have attributed knowledge. So it's another human universal is that we're very free and generous with our attributions of knowledge. The verb to know is one of the most common verbs in any language. So Turkish, Russian, Arabic, Chinese go across languages, and it's one of the most common verbs that embeds a propositional complement. So typically in most of these languages, the most common proposition embedding verb is say, but then know is right up there, right close behind it. And so we're typically very generous in attributing knowledge. But if you start pushing people in the kind of skeptical way, they'll flip over really quickly to deny knowledge. So just to give an example, in some empirical work that I did, we described a little scenario where someone loses track of time and glances at a clock. And in this sort of unelaborated version of the scenario, almost all of our research participants described this person as knowing what time it was after they look at the clock. But if we just insert a little side note, we say, sometimes clocks are broken. And she didn't look at the clock long enough, to be sure that it wasn't broken. Did you know what time it was? Then we see the majority of people denying that there's knowledge. And it's really interesting because this is a situation in which we say that the clock is working. We just say sometimes clocks aren't working. All of a sudden you feel like, oh, maybe this person doesn't have knowledge. And so that's a sort of strange result. And that you can have much more global skeptical scenarios involving dreams and brains in bats. And those show up in all kinds of philosophical traditions. So my own theory about what's going on here is that skepticism is a good thing gone bad. That skepticism is it's an excess of something that ordinarily keeps us in good shape. So ordinarily, we are a very epistemically cooperative species. We share information with each other. When we're not sure about something, we ask other people. The burden of figuring out what's going on in the world is something that human beings really distribute socially. So I don't have to know everything about the world. I have to know things about my patch. And if I'm getting into your part of the world, I can ask you for advice. I can ask you for directions. I can ask you what you know. There's a very, very strong social norm of answering questions. So if a question is asked, over 90% of the time, your conversational partner will just answer it. And the remaining 10% of the time, the move is usually still a kind of a cooperative one. It's the move of just correcting or clarifying some presupposition in the question, or saying, wait, I'm not actually the person that you should ask about this, or something like that. But there's an overwhelming norm or practice in human beings to answer questions. And typically, this is the only circumstance in which you can't answer a question, when you feel you lack knowledge. And the skeptic is just going to put you in a place where you start subjectively feeling that you lack knowledge. Because the skeptic can start by asking you, a really simple question, like, is there water in this bottle? It kind of looks like there is. Tastes like water too. And even that sort of very, very simple common sense reply that you might ordinarily give, the skeptic's going to challenge it. The skeptic's going to ask, how do you really know that is water? That's actually a kind of uncommon conversational move to make. Like typically when people answer a question that's been posed to them, you don't resist the answer that they've given you unless you have good reason to think that there's something wrong with the answer, right? So if you ask somebody for directions, they say, where's the train station? And they say, okay, it's 2 blocks down and then it's on your right. It'd be very unusual to say, are you sure about that? Do you know that that's right? Unless you have some special reason for thinking there's something bad about those directions. So when you get resistance on a question that's been answered, your first instinct is naturally to sort of double check and think again, and you can have that momentary sense that you lack knowledge. There's a very good reason for that, because the question of whether you have or lack knowledge is itself kind of a hard question. And it's not something you can settle just by introspecting. Does this feel like knowledge or not? It's actually a question that we often settle by looking at how other people around us react to what we say. So if you ask me a question, I give you an answer, and you say, oh yeah, okay, thanks, that sounds right. That's a little bit of a confirmation, a little bit of a boost for the idea that I actually did have knowledge when I told you this, right? Because I'm, whatever I said, it fit in with your picture of the world, and that's a good indication. Now, there are some situations in which you could be doubtful of whatever it is I'm saying. But I could nevertheless manage to transmit my knowledge to you. There's basically two ways that we do this. We can give knowledge to somebody else by directing their attention to something. So I can give you perceptual knowledge by, for example, showing you an object and saying, see, it's green, right? Now here I'm just inviting you to use your own knowledge gaining perceptual faculties to see this object and judge for yourself what color it is. You don't have to take my word for it, right? That's one way I can share what I know it's green by looking at it, and I can get you to know it's green by inviting you to look at it as well. So you have your own independent knowledge. Doesn't matter if you don't trust me. Doesn't matter if you think I'm a pathological liar. I show you the object. You get to judge for yourself. The other big way we can get over the hurdle of other people not trusting us when we do know something is we can give them a proof from premises that they are inclined to accept. So I could, prove to you the truth of the Pythagorean theorem, go through a geometrical demonstration. Again, it doesn't matter if you think I'm a liar or you think I don't know very much, even if I myself actually don't know the premises, because I don't really understand what they mean. If I go through drawing the diagram for you and I talk you through the proof, and what I'm presenting you is in fact a sound geometrical proof that you're capable of understanding, you will, by the end of it, gain your own independent knowledge of the truth of the Pythagorean theorem through your own powers of reasoning and deduction. So that's another way that I can transmit knowledge to you if you don't already accept whatever it is I'm saying, or if you're not instinctively inclined to accept whatever it is I'm saying. So when the skeptic comes on the stage with this kind of like questioning posture, he keeps kind of asking, "Oh, are you sure? Why do you think that? What's your reason for thinking that?" You feel some temptation to start arguing with him, right? To start giving him that demonstrative proof. You might already think, if the skeptic's wondering about your claim that there's water in the bottle, you could kind of show it to him. But the skeptic is going to be asking questions about the reliability of the senses that kind of take that move off the table. So you can't just say, "Hey, look for yourself," because the skeptic is already putting you in kind of an argumentative mindset where it doesn't seem legitimate to just rely on the senses. So you're tempted instead to argue, to do some kind of mathematical proof of the truth of whatever it is you're trying to say. And argument is very difficult with somebody who won't accept your premises. It's very, very hard to get going. So the skeptic is kind of like locked in this position of, I think, pretending not to know, pretending to need to be convinced. But he's also making it impossible for you to convince him. Now, that position of putting yourself forward as not knowing, that is the questioning position in conversation. And it's complementary to the telling or informing position where you put yourself forward as knowing, right? But if you're in a conversation with somebody who refuses to ever take on board what you're going to say, kind of left with that epistemic disparity between the parties to the conversation. The skeptic will always be, in that questioning posture, refusing to get out of the not knowing posture. The more you try to convince them that there is something you know, the more you'll start feeling like you don't know it, because the skeptic is refusing to take on board what you're saying. And kind of the only way to resolve the conversation, so conversations are typically resolved. This is the work of John Heritage, so great sociologist of conversation. Conversations are typically resolved when the two parties find themselves on a level with respect to their knowledge on a certain point. So if I'm asking you for directions, I'm positioning myself as not knowing. I'm asking you, so I'm positioning you as knowing. You tell me, then I will mark that I've come up to level and now I know as well. I'll say, "Oh, thank you." And that's indicating that I've gained knowledge from you. We're done. We can quit. Sometimes I could ask you a question and you could say, "I don't know either." And then again, we're on the level. We're both in that not knowing position together. That's also a stable position. The conversation is over. If I don't know and you don't know either, then there's nowhere to go. And that's the place the skeptic wants to take you. Wants to take you to that place where neither of you knows. It is a position of conversational stability. It's not a position where I know something and you don't, or you know something and I don't. Either of those positions is unstable, and it asks one party to inform the other. Because we are epistemically cooperative, we generally like to share or pool or maximize our knowledge. The skeptic is just putting himself in a position of, well, let's get the level straight between us, but let's minimize. Let's go down to zero together. So that, I think, is what the skeptic is doing. And I'll give you one piece of advice for how to deal with the skeptic if you encounter this character. And of course, I teach introductory philosophy to teenagers, so I have encountered this character, right? The kid at the back of the room who refuses to be convinced by anything. The trick is to recognize what the different conversational roles and positions are doing for the characters involved. So the skeptic is the person who keeps asking you questions. And the trick with that character is to start asking him questions. So if somebody's being persistently skeptical, the thing to do is not to try to prove something to them, because you're never going to get there, because they're not going to give you any premises, any material to work with. The thing to do with somebody who's being persistently skeptical is to ask them questions. Move yourself into the position of the questioner and say, well, why are you asking me that? Why does it seem to you that I don't know? I think if you can go there, you can get the skeptic on the defensive. And at some point, you might, if you're very lucky, get the skeptic to realize that sort of the conversational dynamic between two human beings actually does assume that we're capable of gaining knowledge together. If you're talking to another human being, there's some kind of presupposition in the background that communication isn't a waste of time. And it's not something we do just for ourselves as individuals. It's something we do together. Now, you might, in the end, there's one more skeptic you have to worry about, which is sort of the self-skeptic. Because you might think, oh no, wait, Descartes was like all alone in a room when he came up with his Cartesian skepticism. He's just asking himself questions. But I think you can maybe apply the same kind of recipe there as well. That I think there's a sense in which self-questioning is kind of an interiorization of social questioning. So just as in social questioning, you're trying to pull out knowledge from people around you, cooperate with them, learn from them. So also when you question yourself, you're trying to pull out knowledge from yourself. And that's also often a really good thing to do. So you ask yourself, where are my keys? And you start thinking, oh, where did I put them? You start rehearsing your movements, since you realize I must have had them when I came home because I got in the door and then I went to the kitchen. Start asking yourself questions as a way of sort of pulling up from within yourself things you actually do know. But you can also go pathological when you're self-questioning. You don't usually do this when you're trying to find your keys, but you could start asking yourself questions and start refusing to take any of those answers. Maybe I didn't really go to the kitchen after I got home. Maybe that was a hallucination. Of course, if you try to do that in a practical context, it's really frustrating and you won't find your keys. But you might think you can do it in a sort of purely philosophical context. I think there also the thing to do is to stop at some point and ask yourself, why am I asking myself all these questions? And what is it to ask oneself a question? And then you can start making actually positive progress on the problem. So I think that's my sort of quick story about skepticism, how to deal with it. And I hope it helps.